What should architects be doing to remain relevant?
Why? What connection do they have together? They're not complaining about Pret. Everybody likes a Pret sandwich.
That is quite a lot of development.
What's wrong with that? I'll be a bit rude and a bit helpful. I'm Martyn Evans. I'm Landsec's creative director.
Martyn, welcome to Urban Forecast.
Thank you.
So this is a show about the future of cities.
Yeah.
But I'm going to start with a quote from you, if that's
okay.
all right.
Oh, God. Is it all right?
I think it's good. I really like it. I really like it.
Okay.
So all of life happens in and around property. We fall in love, we have babies, we eat, sleep, have fun, learn and die. All in and around buildings. So unless you understand life and people, you can't begin to make the places which will house their lives. So looking back at your career, was there a particular moment where that kind of thinking crystallized?
Yeah, I was lucky enough when I first started working, when I left college, to go and work at the Body Shop for Anita Roddick. At the time, that was the late 1980s, was a hugely successful company then. It had just floated in the mid-80s. It was at its absolute zenith. And she was an incredibly influential businesswoman. And I was this young, naive, green kid who was lucky enough to get a job there and go and work quite closely with her. And I learned from her that you could do business in a way that meant you did good stuff and that you could come to work every day and feel proud of the social impact that you might make through your work. And by doing that, make an awful lot of money. And that was so simple to me, I couldn't really understand why you would think any other way about coming to work and having a job and doing business. Why would you not want to make a load of money by doing good stuff? And I learned from her that doing good stuff was about caring about people, because in the end we all make money by transacting with other people. Other people give us money to do stuff, to do what we know how to do. And all of those things that we get paid to do are about making things that make people's lives a little bit easier or a little bit better. So I'm sure we'll talk about it as we continue our conversation, but I sort of fell into the property business. But all the jobs that I've had since then, not many, I've just come to work every day feeling exactly the same thing. That why would you not come to work imagining that you need to understand how people want to live, and whether you sell them a bottle of shampoo for their hair, or whether you sell them a home to live in, much more important, or whether you make an office for them to go to work and earn their living, or a hospital for them to get better when they're sick. Why would you not imagine that you will do that 10 times better if you understand those people and the lives that they have and the needs that they have, in order that you make the very best building possible? Because if you do that, that building will probably be more valuable and you'll make more money for your shareholders.
And so do you want to talk about how you fell into property? I think it's an interesting story.
I'd been working in New York for the Body Shop, and I had a great time living and working in Manhattan. I was in my 20s, and the company was very successful, and it moved to North Carolina, to a small town in rural North Carolina. And that was not for me. So I came back to London, and I didn't have a job. And I met a guy who had just bought the old Truman Brewery in Brick Lane. And I didn't know anything about that part of London. It was not a part of London that I'd been in very much. And we met through a mutual friend. And I went to visit him and learned about this incredible place that he had bought. His business had been, he'd been in fashion business. He had rented warehousing from the brewery for years with his family business. And the brewery had closed up and moved out and gone east to somewhere. And he was in the right place at the right time with money, and he did a very smart thing and bought a very, very smart piece of real estate. But I think he, in his inexperience of being a property developer, hadn't understood that thing that we all know about very well, which is that 500 yards from the most expensive real estate in the world, around Broadgate and the city, there is no guarantee that 500 yards the other way, that property will be valuable at all, because people just don't understand it, because you cross a street in London and you go from one world to another. And at that time, in the mid-90s, Spitalfields was undeveloped. Brick Lane was a place where you went to buy bagels or eat a curry, and it was not a place where you went to have fun other than that. And I didn't have any idea how to help him. I was just going and visiting as a friend of a friend. And I said, well, if you're having trouble developing this, it's because it's dead. You need to make it come alive. People need to come here, and you need to give them a reason to come. And he said, like what? And I said, I don't know, a cup of coffee, food, art, music. So he said, well, I don't know how to do that either. And so there was a team of people there. I joined the team, and we began together the work of changing that place. And I was naive and inexperienced, and I had no idea what to do. But I just pitched in, and what I did know how to do was open shops. And so there was a cafe, and then there were some shops, and then an art show, and we just fumbled along until it started to work. And it took a while, because if you don't have money to do that sort of thing, it's tough. You just have to graft. And that guy is one of the smartest people I ever met, and his clever team of people around him were just immensely hard workers and immensely smart, and they did the right thing. And very slowly that place began to emerge. And one person came, and then two, and then four, and then eight. And I learned that there is another way of doing property development other than investing a load of money, knocking some old buildings down and building some new ones. That actually what people want is authenticity and, I don't know how you might define this, but realness in place. And that in that place came from a presumption of reuse rather than demolition and rebuild, because you don't have any money to demolish or rebuild. So we just had to get on with what we had, and that meant literally picking up a broom and sweeping out pigeon crap and fixing the lock on the door. There was a presumption that you would then share risk with your tenants. So kids out of college with fashion brand would come and say, can I take this storefront? And you'd say, really? And they say, well, if you want it, you can have it. You have to clean it out and paint it and change the doors and you do all that. But, off you go. And we won't take any rent off you. But if you start making money, we'll take a bit of rent. And then when you make a bit more money, we'll take a bit more rent. So he started running the turnover rent, started with that kind of process. So then you understand that there's a shared risk then between landlord and tenant. And a shared endeavour to make a place good. And as those places got more and more and the critical mass of people doing interesting things grew, there was a sense of shared purpose in getting people to come to that place. And it was about working together to see a common goal, which is change a place from being a place where nobody comes to a place where lots of people come. And then you get to a point where you then start being able to have choices about what you do. Because when you get people and they bring their pounds in their hands to buy coffee and cake and see art shows and shop for clothes, and suddenly you start creating real estate value.
What do you think? I mean, because that program it sounds like it emerged quite organically, and I think I've read you kind of just opened the doors and had let the public come in and said, what do you want?
Well, so that guy who owned that place was just super smart, and we would clean out a building, and he'd say, we'd say, what should we do in there? And he'd like, I don't know. And so he just said one day on one of the big buildings, that's the one that's got the chimney in it, halfway up Brick Lane, why don't we just open the doors and let people wander in and see what they want to do? And it was a beautiful sunny day. It's got a glass roof over half of that building. And people had bought their sandwiches, and they just went in there and sat on the floor and ate their sandwiches inside this lovely building with this beautiful chimney in the middle with the glass roof. And so then it seemed, well, okay, let's should make this in a restaurant. Then it was a restaurant.
You collectively, but they did there is amazing. But I think what you had as an advantage there was good bones, and you kept those good bones in terms of in the city. Because I've looked at that piece of city quite a lot. I wrote my dissertation, funnily enough, on that particular thing. And there is a kind of the pattern of the street is quite interesting, and the kind of thing. But instead of demolishing it all and creating massive blocks, you did something where you actually shaped the. We've been talking about rather.
But that wasn't a plan.
Really? Okay.
I mean, I think you can find good bones pretty much anywhere. I think I challenge you on what good bones are. I mean, if you're working in a street like this, where you've got, solid, interesting old industrial buildings, but long before you were here on this street, or any restaurant that made this street famous, this was a shitty street in a shitty part of London that were crappy old block brick industrial units. The issue about the Truman and then other places like it around the world, and there are lots of them, is that we had no choice. There was no great pot of money to invest in demolition. I mean, demolition's expensive, right? And then if you demolish, what are you going to do? Rebuild. How? If you haven't got any money. Yeah. So you have no choice. We had to use the buildings that were there and make what we could of them. And so that's why I say he was just a smart guy, brave, smart guy, who decided he would just throw himself into, with his family and all the people that he gathered around him, one of whom was me, to just make that place work. And it works now still.
It's a great place.
The scheme that is just about to start is the first new build on that site for 30 years.
And are you involved in that?
No.
And what's your thoughts on it? Do you think that they might take away the magic of the place by?
I think they've got to be careful.
Yeah.
Because the choices you made were easy because you couldn't choose other than to let it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard work, but they were easy choices because there was only one choice.
Yeah. Whereas now they have the ability to get it wrong.
But they've got a good developer partner. They've got a good roster of architects. They've picked well. Chris Dyson's involved, who has lived next door for decades. So they couldn't have done better in terms of working with a developer funding partner and putting a team of designers together to do it. What I think will guarantee that it will be done well is its legacy.
Yeah.
Who is going to dare to mess that up? What they've created over the last 30 years in that place is extraordinary. I only worked there for a very short period of time at the beginning of it. The team that have built that place to what it is now has done the most extraordinary thing about creating the most incredible value. And if you think about that business model that I explained a few minutes ago, where it different from the sort of property development that I do now, which is more traditional development company where we build a lot, that model is very successful in delivering very, very authentic places because it just happens very slowly and organically, and only the right thing happens. If something happens that doesn't work, it fails, and then something else comes. The problem with that is that's great, creates incredible value. The problem with it is it takes too long. It's been 30 years since they started seriously working on that place. I think it's been amazing for at least 10 years. So therefore you could say it took 20 years for that place to really become what it is and become famous the world over. Everybody that uses it in some way is completely confident that the way they use it is successful and contributes to the mix of uses in that place. So if there was a way of using those mechanisms and that experience to build those places and be able to do it quicker, that would be the sweet spot.
What you were talking about, and you describe yourself as a writer, I think developer and thinker, and I was sort of wondering how those interact. And well, you can, maybe you don't, but I think
I don't know, that sounds a bit highfalutin. What I think about that though is that there must be a way of doing that. And the only reason why you would imagine there isn't a way of doing that is because it feels like it's two different ways. There's that way that is authentic and clever and smart and super hard work, but works and creates amazing places. A bit like this street.
It's got some industrial heritage.
If you took Viner Street and decided that you were going to say it was a place, no one person has developed this street. Well, not quite. But it has become something else in the, again, probably decades. I mean, when did Bistrotech open?
Before we moved here 10 years ago.
Way before that.
So 20 years maybe?
More.
Yeah, right, okay. Yeah.
when they came, and so this place has grown in the same way. No, there's not been some grand master plan to invest in all these buildings on this street. It's just happened little by little by little, as a bit of success met another bit of success, and someone else put a bit of risk, and someone else put a bit of risk. But what I think is, if you then sat and analysed that and worked out how it worked, if you had the right intention and the right money, you could do a better job. And I hope that's what I'm trying to do now.
Well, so I wanted to ask, what do you think of the things that you took into Cathedral and you and I subsequent and now Landsec?
And understand. So what I was very lucky about, after I found myself suddenly being in the property business, even though that was by accident, around about the same time I met a guy called Richard Upton, who started a company called Cathedral, that is the company I still work for now in its third incarnation as part of Landsec. Had the same energy, drive and vision as Ofer Zalouf, who started the Truman Brewery project. That same idea that he got out of bed every morning not to be a property developer, but to do something good, do something cool and interesting, meaningful.
Purpose,
to do something meaningful. And if by doing something meaningful that created a successful business, doubly good, right? So I think I was just lucky to meet the team at the Truman and be part of it. And I was lucky then to meet Richard, and at the very beginning of his business, where I was probably just about employee number 1 or 2 at the time, and work out how to do that with him. Now, we didn't have much money then either. For a long time, we were a entrepreneurial, underfunded development business. But we had access to money because we were good at what we did. We created good schemes and got good planning consents, and then built with other people's money. And our job then was to help those people with the money who were by definition not the expert property developers. They were the investors.
Yep.
They might have been a pension fund, they might have been a family office or an individual investor, to understand that if they wanted to really make a great place with long-term enduring value, that they might want to think about doing it this way and not that way.
And that's what, because you're creative director now, and there's not a lot of developers that have a creative director.
No.
So, but do you think that the essence of what you do is it's a creative approach to regeneration?
Well, where I think we've landed up in the right place, going from being a startup in the late 90s to being part of Landsec, is that Landsec is a REIT. So that means that it exists to invest in property and hold it for the long term and take the rental income that comes from it. So fundamental to Landsec's business plan is the creation of long-term value in the places that we build and hold and curate, and the maximizing of the income that derives from the value in those places. So the better those places are, the more people will pay to be part of them, and the more valuable they become in the long term. So fundamental to that big property development business is the creation of valuable, good places. And so for me, even though you might characterize large property development companies as not quite the same as those small rogue entrepreneurs who make places like the Truman Brewery, there's no reason why they can't be, because it's fundamental to its business. And so that's my job at Landsec, is to work as part of now a very big team of 650 people, working out how to make the kind of places that Landsec builds and owns and manages and curates in the long term good.
Mm. And what does good mean? What's the magic ingredients?
I'm going to go back to your first question. They have to be right for the people who want to use them. And it's not rocket science. It really isn't. Good places are places where people want to be. For all those reasons, right? We make big mixed-use places that have homes and offices and shops and restaurants and doctor's surgeries and play areas for kids and pet veterinary surgeons and all those things that people need to have good lives. They're mixed in use and mixed in tenure. So if we're delivering in partnership with local authorities, where we're delivering a quantum of social housing, there's a mixed tenure across the residential. So our places that we build pretty much always, when they're mixed in use places, not shopping centres or big office buildings that we also have, you're trying to create a place where all of the people who either live or work or visit or have some connection with those places have a good life because of those places. And if they do, those places become more valuable.
Yeah, it's that cycle of meaning creates value.
Yeah.
If it's meaningless,
and that goes back to my story about Anita right at the beginning. I don't really understand why you would think about it in any other way.
Yeah,
I honestly don't. And it's so simple to me. It's hard to do.
Yeah,
don't get me wrong. I'm not being patronising about that. It's hard to do, but it's simple to think about.
Yeah,
it's simple to imagine, and then you've got to work out. Okay, it's not hard to get that tick. Now, how do we do it?
There were some other ingredients there which we've seen in other places. So Hackney Wick over the road has some similarities. You had a big artistic community doing informal things. It's slightly different. But you had the young British artists in Shoreditch and Hoxton and those areas before the Truman Brewery. And I think it was one artist, I think it was Grayson Perry, said that the artists are the shock troops of regeneration. So how tying into different communities, you get different, that sort of one community, isn't it? And does that give a strength? But then also there are other communities, and how do you tie those together to create meaning for different groups of people?
You have to learn.
Yeah.
You have to go and ask questions. You have to do this. You have to talk. It is short-sighted to imagine that if you're a property developer with any ability to create change in a place, that what you need to understand is how to put one brick on top of another and put some glass and steel in between, and how to work with an architect and an engineer and a cost consultant and a contractor. Those are literally the building blocks of making places, but they are it's interesting to think about what we call parity and beyond. If you're going to be a property developer, parity in competitive marketplaces, put buildings up. Put buildings up that will stay standing, where the roof won't leak, where the electricity stays on, and the front door's got a lock.
Yeah.
And then you have a lawyer who writes a lease and somebody who collects the rent. Right?
That is quite a lot of development.
That's the basis. If you're going to create more value than that, then you have to go beyond that. You have to understand what kind of building. Why is it the shape that it is? What's it for? Who are you going to put in it? When you put somebody in it, who are you putting next door to them? Why? What connection do they have together? And if you have one little building on Viner Street, you've got a relatively limited opportunity to make an impact. Some still, but limited. If you've got 30 acres of land, like I have the incredible privilege to be part of a team working on transforming 30 acres of land in central Manchester at the minute, you have the most unbelievably exciting opportunity to sit with your architects and your engineers and your cost consultants with a blank sheet of paper and draw a picture and tell a story about a place.
But how do you deal with that friction between it being too planned? Like the things from your background.
It's not friction. It isn't. Because
but how can you allow 30 acres to evolve organically?
Well, you don't. But that's my point. Is that if you're clever, the sweet spot about going back to the Truman as an example is that happened organically mostly because we didn't really know what we were doing, and we learned every time something went wrong, you don't do that again. You do that. And then when something worked, you're like, oh, more of that, please. That's 30 years ago. So I've been around the block a few times since then. And so I feel with some colleagues, and particularly with the architect practices that we work with a lot, we've got a lot of experience about thinking about things now. And so it's much easier to plan for that. And so I suppose what I'm trying to do is do what I think the sweet spot is, which is do that quicker and easier and better and with less grief and aggro. And so it is like playing a musical instrument. You have to have a score. You have to have the strings tuned. You have to hold it the right way. Then this happens. And you make the music by using the tools that you've put very carefully in place, the music on the stand and the violin in the right place. And so I'd never say that those 30 acres in Manchester are planned down to the last, because I don't know what restaurants are going to come there. We're not going to write a lease for a food operator there for another couple of years yet. Who even knows whether the businesses that are going to come there have started yet? But what I do know is the vibe that I want it to have. And that's partly because of what we've done there in the interim. I don't want to use that word meanwhile, it's so ghastly. But when we took that site on, it has great big huge railway depot as part of it that's been empty for 50 years. It's an Edwardian building, so it's beautiful in its own right. At the minute, what's in it is a huge nightclub, a 10,000 capacity large live music venue, and a big food and drink operation that's a bit like Mercato.
Yeah, I've been there. It's good.
Yeah, called Escape to Freight Island. And those things have operated very successfully for the last 5 years. We've had 3 million people through the doors paying money to eat and drink and have fun and dance in those things. Now, they're not going to stay there because they're too big and we're going to build around those buildings. But some sense of them will stay. So there will be a live music venue. There will be food and drink. And given that 3 million people have come through our doors and paid money to enjoy what we've offered them, we'd be lunatics to imagine that the tone we want to create in the long term in that place is not similar to the thing that people have enjoyed. So we've got a creative brief, if you like, because we've done it. We've done our research, we've done our market research. And so when we brief our agents, they're not going to bring us a list of prep, eat, those things. They're going to go and find interesting people that will long-term create the vibe that we've created in the short term.
That's what's so powerful, I think, about your role, actually, having a sort of creative thought, setting the narrative from the beginning.
I ask the questions. Ask the questions and tell the story. So I'm a storyteller.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, agents, for instance, they'll just do their job, which they do really well and incredibly professionally, but they'll do it the same as they did it for the client they saw yesterday and the client they saw the day before that. It's their job to understand the market and who's in the market looking for a 1,000 square feet unit in the centre of Manchester, and they just come with a list and they push it across the table and they say, here are the businesses, and that's how you end up with Joe and the Juice.
And they've got good covenants. So what I've found in trying to create a narrative, what's happened on other sites, there's a lot of pushback because basically, obviously, the investors want covenants to make sure that they're going to get their investment back, and they want boots and they want M&S and they want whatever that will then guarantee.
They don't want a candlestick maker and a bike repair shop.
So you have to be able to respond to that and tell a story that either accepts that that's the right thing to do or says that there's something better. And something better doesn't mean being arsey or snobby or turning your nose up, because the reason that Joe and the Juice is a successful business is because people like it.
Yeah.
So I've got nothing against Joe and the Juice at all. Right? Very successful business that people like. People that I work with go there every day on Victoria Street. What you want to try to do is create a sense of distinctiveness in a place. That's what people who complain about those businesses are complaining about. Really, they're not complaining about Pret. Everybody likes a Pret sandwich. Right? They just don't like the fact that there's Pret, Eat, Joe and the Juice, Leon next to each other. There, and there. And so you go from Victoria Street to Covent Garden to Oxford Street, and there's no difference to the place. And then it's just endlessly depressing. What you're trying to do is create distinctiveness, because distinctiveness creates value. You want people to keep coming back again and again and again to places, because a proportion of the people who you want to come are not there because they've got no choice. So the reason that those places that are on the bottom of big office buildings are all the same is because they've got a captive audience of people who want their lunch 10 feet below their office up there. They don't need to be distinctive. They're just serving the people who are walking down the escalator every day to get their lunch, and it's perfectly good business. Done. If you want people who've got a choice whether they come there or not to come and add another layer of business, then you've got to ask those people nicely, will you please come to my place? And if to ask them nicely is to offer them something unusual and thoughtful and interesting and exciting and distinctive.
And would Landsec take a view on whether the covenant was less good, or whether those places can pay slightly less because it will create footfall, which creates better long-term value?
So Landsec is in the business of just doing the best thing for the value creation for our shareholders. Right? Mm-hmm. That's what we come to work to do every day. So there's no right or wrong. Mm-hmm. If I make an argument there because of my knowledge or understanding, I'm just one voice in a large organisation making a case for maybe trying to do something different. Now, at Landsec, I've got a responsibility that if I open my mouth and suggest that we do something that's not the norm, I better be able to justify it in language that the people who make the decisions want to understand. And if I can't, I don't know what I'm coming to work for.
Yeah.
You know, that's my job,
yeah.
right, to do that. Because I'm not advocating a different way because it's fun or because it's nice or because it's cool. I'm advocating a different way of doing things because it's more valuable and more successful.
Yeah.
And therefore it's upon me to step into the world of analysis that companies like mine want to use to decide where to put their money and give them the respect that they deserve because they've got the money, you know, with the check. So that's a very interesting argument. I would like to have a conversation, and it's not easy, about redefining covenant. You know, do you have covenant through, can you create a value of covenant through footfall? Can you say that if you make a place that is distinctively distinctive, more people will come? And if more people come, there's more money and that. Now, they might not have covenant in the traditional sense of the word. Maybe there's a mix of things. Maybe it starts with a mix. But I find that if you make a intellectually rigorous argument to people who live by spreadsheets, they listen, because those people who run and work senior levels in big property development companies in our country are clever, intelligent people who make decisions based on evidence. And so I think it's upon people like me to respect that and bring them the evidence in the language they want to hear, and so that they can make a different decision that is equally or perhaps more value creating.
I think it's really important. I think we get frustrated, and I know you've talked about it before, but developers are often framed as the villains of the piece.
Right.
And it's like...
But not by them, by you.
Well, not by me.
us.
Not by us.
By Keir Starmer this weekend.
Yeah, all right.
Not
yes,
us.
Sometimes you.
We have been developers. We understand.
Yeah, okay.
We are like pro-developer.
I'll take that
architects.
back. Well, I say that only because that's a very standard trope of relationship between developers and their architects. Often is that developers often think that architects, creative people who've got their head in the clouds, and architects think that developers are the villains, Philistines who value engineer the shit out of everything. It's a boring trope that describes the relationship. And I spend a lot of time talking to people like you in my day job, but also outside of my day job. And I want all the time to encourage both developers and architects across a table to understand each other better and find better common language to discuss. And on the developer side of the table, that's about listening and understanding that architects have a skill that they don't, and that they have a way of creating value out of what seems sometimes like magic. Yeah. Because that's what creativity often feels like. And that's hard to accept when magic isn't a line on a spreadsheet. But go with it, please. And then on your side of the table, an understanding that if you're going to persuade your client that the decisions you want to make and the ideas you have will make them more money, explain how. Yeah. And that hardly ever happens. Now, you guys, as you say, have been developers. So you've done it. You know, you have stood at the coalface and scratched your head about a spreadsheet.
Learned some things.
And learned some very, very hard lessons, right?
Things.
I'm certain you've learned some very hard lessons. But I say to architects all the time, come in my office and tell me how you're going to use your skills to make my company more money. And please don't hear that as a ghastly, distasteful thing to think. No. That's why we're all here. Right.
But financial value is intimately connected to meaning, in my view, because people go to places they want to go, and so there are different values, but there is people will pay more for something that's interesting. You'll go to a nice place and have a coffee or a meal because it's a great experience. Yeah. So I think in a world now where we've got increasingly people buying everything online, actually going into places is quite important. Yeah, it's quite important because you can just press a button and get it delivered to your door. So I do think that kind of spatial place experience is even more important to us.
It totally is, but there needs to be a common understanding of what that means. What is it that is a good place? A lot of the ways in which we appraise ideas that create value in our business are not very good. if we are deciding how much money we're going to give you in a budget to build a block of flats, to design and build a block of flats with, what do? We go into the market and we look at what a 2-bedroom flat 100 yards down the road sold for. And if the only flats 100 yards down the road are crap, then you're going to get a crap number to deal with. And if you say to the funder, we can do better than that, they're like, how? Like, well, we'll just make better flats and they'll be worth more and people will pay more money. And they say, prove it. And you go, because that's hard. And you can only prove it by doing it.
Well, exactly, because a lot of...
And if you can't get the money to do it, it's a chicken and egg
valuation
thing.
looks back rather than forwards.
Yep.
And so you're always going to be limited by...
Yeah, so that's a problem.
If you're changing a place,
Yeah.
you're going to be limited by the upper limit.
But that is everywhere in business for as long as there's ever been business. That's Henry Ford saying, if you ask people what they want, they'll say a faster horse.
Yeah.
So who knew that little device that's in all of our pockets was going to be our portal to the world instead of a thing we ring our mothers on.
Yeah. But I think there are examples, the Truman Brewery, one of them, where you can change value, right? The value of Truman Brewery now than where it was 20 years ago is probably completely different.
Oh,
so there are,
yeah.
So I think there are examples. We talk a lot with local authorities, and I know you've also been doing some work advising local authorities. And I think one of the key, in my experience, and it sounds like yours, but welcome your feedback, is joining the dots between these different people. You're talking about the divide between architects and developers as one, sometimes also then local authorities and politicians and developers are another, and then local communities of different types.
You can't underestimate the value of storytelling. Because we're all engaged in any projects that we might do together to make a place. It's not quick, right? That scheme that I'm working on in Manchester, we go on site in a few weeks with our first building. I stood up in a room and pitched to win that scheme in spring 2016. Yeah, 15 or 16. So that's
almost 10 years.
Nearly 10 years.
Yeah.
Now, there's been COVID in the middle and a few problems. But these things take a long time. And so you've got to keep it up. You've got to keep the passion going. And as each month passes, teams get larger and larger. You hire an architect and then an engineer and then a cost consultant and acoustics and M&E and planning consultants. And suddenly you've got 1,000 people working on your thing. And they've all got different skills and they've all got different ideas about what should be on 30 acres of Manchester. No. You have to lead the vision that makes them all imagine that they're going in the same direction with the same passion. And that's not how is that brick sitting on the top of that other brick. It's what we're doing.
Yeah.
What we're doing in this place. What's our end goal? And our end goal is to create a finished place where everybody who comes there every day, who wakes up there every morning, who comes to work there every day, who brings their children to play in the park on Saturdays, is happy.
Is what you're saying, I think, that, you need to create, meaning in a in a place.
Yes.
That you need to... Oh, I've lost my train of thought now. But
no, you make a good point. You make a very good point. So I go back to my beginning of this conversation. When I went to work at the Body Shop, I didn't really know that company. I didn't see it on the high street. It was in the 80s. You couldn't really open a newspaper or turn the television on without seeing something about it. So I knew it existed, but I wasn't a great consumer of that business. Didn't have a lot of hair then. But the minute I went to work there, even though I was the newest employee, by the end of the first week, I could have recited the company mantra, whatever it was, in my sleep.
Yep.
Because the experience of being in that company every day was such that you couldn't avoid understanding what it came to work every day to do. From the pictures on the walls to the pronouncements of the chief executive when she was standing on a stage in front of an audience, to the brochures that you would read, the shelf talkers, the bottle labels, everything screamed the story in the most clear, most compelling way. And so if you didn't agree with it, you couldn't win. You had to leave.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that, right? If you didn't fit in or it wasn't for you, go.
Well, I think architects do have this role, or can have this role, when we're doing our jobs well
and we have developers that don't have a creative director who's able to like captain that ship. We get to be the ones
Totally.
that can weave that narrative, and we can act as a bit of an interlocutor between the local authority.
Exactly can.
And
I
the
say this
developer.
all the time to architects that I stand in front of. You have the skills, right? That's what you do. You're creative people who tell stories about buildings and places. So if your client is in need of that skill, provide it.
Yeah.
And be really clear in your provision of it. The architect's practice that I've worked with most closely over the 30 years that I've done my job is Studio Ackroyd West. I think we've probably done 20-something projects together. And I'll say this out loud because I've said it to David before now. Sometimes we say, oh, God, couldn't we go and find somebody new to work with? And then we go out and we look, and then we sort of sit around the table and go, no good. Pick the phone up. Because
Well, lucky you're here now.
I know. I'm telling you that because it's a funny story.
Yeah.
Because what they do is what we want.
Yeah.
They are fantastic architects, but they are also incredible storytellers.
Yes.
And always with them, when we sit around a table and say, we've got some, wait till you see what we've got for you today, this bit of land. There's a blank piece of paper in the middle of the table, there's a pot of coloured pens, and we start to think about what we might do. We don't think about buildings for 2 or 3 meetings. We just talk about people and their lives and what's happened on this site over the last 100 years, what might happen for the next 100 years, what's going on in the city, what's missing. You just start to construct your story. And I tell the students that I stand in front of, start with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a place. And then finish with the end. And then fill in the chapters in between of the story that you want to tell. And when you tell your story, drawing the buildings is easy.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. I think that's amazing summary, isn't it? So to create meaning, you need the story, because otherwise people just can't understand it.
And when you've got a story, you know what you're doing. And when you've got a story, everybody can read it and everybody can have the book club and discuss it and get behind it.
Yeah.
And then if someone says, oh, no, that story's wrong, you're like, no, the story's good. That doesn't mean you can't be challenged, because oftentimes you get to chapter 3 and it won't work.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, shit. But you can't, so you've got to change chapter 4, but you can't change the end. You've got to change the way you get to the end. It's like one of those books where you can choose
Which
which stories, but it's probably going to get to the same place in the end. Happy ever after, right?
So you just talked a bit about advice for architects.
Yeah.
We actually met at a RIBA roundtable.
We did.
About kind of how architects can retain their relevance. So as a final question, have you got any advice to those in the profession kind of want to save it from itself? What should architects be doing to remain relevant?
I'll be a bit rude and a bit helpful. My being a bit rude is about saying that the architecture profession has been extraordinarily good, like the medical profession, at creating a narrative about its value that isn't an awful lot to do with the end user. There's this sort of mystical notion that architects are these great wizards who create these amazing things. I say keep doing that, because that's where the iron-fisted confidence in the ability, in the value of your skill comes from. But you are a commercial business with a customer, and you have to help your customer to be more successful through the skills that you have. Just tell yourself that every day. And if that means you have to learn how better to explain what you do to your customers so that they understand the value of what you do and want more of it and are prepared to pay you more to have it, what's wrong with that? Right? So I started an organisation in 2016 called YADA, the Young Architects and Developers Alliance. It's really simple. It's a networking organisation for young architects and young developers to meet and have a beer and a bit of pizza and talk. Nothing else. Because I have spent my whole career knocking mostly white middle-class middle-aged men's heads together in architecture and in property development to listen to each other and understand each other a bit better. And I sort of given up. And I worked out that it's because right at the beginning of careers in both of those industries, language goes in the opposite direction.
And you're told you're the most important one.
And exactly. And I stand in front of architecture students and I ask them, when did you last see a development appraisal on a spreadsheet? And not a single hand goes up.
We don't understand what it is.
Nope. And then I ask the development surveying students that I might talk to, when did you last go on a tour of a Sterling Prize nominated building with its architect and listen to what you're being told? 0 hands go up. So I know that it goes wrong early. And so it's very simple to me. You just put people in a room and have them talk and understand each other. And if you can do that, problems get solved 10 times quicker and greater value is created. So for you as architects, learn how to speak your clients, your customers, stop calling them clients, learn how to speak your customers' language.
Yep.
And inspire them. There's a reason that I don't know what phones you use, but there's a reason why we've all paid nearly £1,000 for our phones in our pockets that do not much more than a phone you can go to WH Smith's and buy for $39.99. Right? It's because we are sold a dream that there is this incredible value in this product that we all need. Now that's a lot of hype. What you do is not a lot of hype. You've got the material to do real value, right?
Yeah.
Create real value. So, and I just don't think often that architects that I meet every day understand that well enough, understand how to communicate that well enough. There's absolutely no shortage of talent and ability to create immense value in this industry. It just is locked up and hidden.
Thank you. It's a very inspiring note to finish on. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for
My
coming on
pleasure.
today.
It was really
Cheers.
good to talk to you.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.